Okay, welcome back. Would you believe I'm attacking the subject of the finish again? Will we ever be finished with the finish? This time, though, we wanted to sort of personalize it just a little bit based on a comment or a query from Selma, who was in the summer workshop with me in London. And but I just want to thank, before I do that, I just want to thank Nancy D for your repeated wonderful contribution to the cause. Thank you for that donation. And Jacqueline M. and John J. for your recurring ones. I think you've set those up to be automatic, and I really find those beneficial, shall we say. All right. So very good. Let's look at what Selma has to say. At which point, she says, at what point? At which point, yeah. Do you call a painting finished even though it doesn't capture the beauty of what you see as much as you'd want to? And how much time would you allow yourself to work on a picture before saying that you just need to accept that this is the best you can do with your current skill level and move on to the next? Isn't that interesting? And Tarbell, we have saying, if I just might someday do one truly like, in the end of his life, it sounds to me like he must have had to make that decision every day, or shall we say at the end of every painting. It's an interesting question, though, and people try to solve it in a variety of different ways. For example, people will just make a certain style as long as the picture is dominated by a certain style. I'm not showing you pictures of hers. It just occurs to me right now to mention Lempicka doing that sort of an Art Deco style thing. And you can see how that covers, what you might say, covers a multitude of sins. And yet, style won't still cover it all. For example, if you still, there'll still be anomalies in your painting. You'll say, there's something I can't figure out. There's something that's just wrong in this thing. And yeah, and there is such a thing as moving on to the next one, and that's called being human. Shall we say that? I sometimes think of it as poetry in itself, though. I mean, do you think the poet is working on this poem? He's got it just perfect. There's always something. There's always something about the rhyme scheme, the phrasing, you know, the quality of the expression. There's something about it that just doesn't line up, doesn't match with your vision for the thing, which gets us to the point about, do you have a vision for the thing? You know what I mean? I've toyed with, and I wouldn't torture with my. I hope I never have tortured you with my poetry writing, but I have found there's something so crucial about it. The first couple lines of your poem, getting enough there for you to say, yeah. That summing, there's a sort of I find a sort of a summing up needed by me, at least, in the initial couple lines of the poem. They usually contain the flow, which you might call, the rhyme, rhythm, that sort of thing. But they'll also contain the seeds of the content of where it might go, um, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, whatever kinds of words you find valuable. So, but having that vision, you can get to a place where it's not all closed, but it's adequate. It really does do the job. And that's going to be the hardest part of making your picture satisfactory. If you just start copying what's in front of you with no vision, I don't think there's any way you're going to know when you've gotten to the point that you want to be at, when you've really succeeded, right? But there are many levels of success. And so the question is this adequate? That's called the anti-perfectionist position, right? And perfectionism, somebody said watch out that the perfect doesn't become the enemy of the good. And what that, frequently happens in, for example, in politics, you may have a very, very important thing that needs to get done, but you can't get everybody on the same page because of some minor little thing that if you just weren't so perfectionistic about, you'd probably be able to get two more votes, enough to pass your your legislation, assuming that good things come through legislation. A lot of bad things do. Um, so, but that having a vision is such a big deal. and then keep watching. That's the thing I keep saying you want to do. Keep watching so you can see whether you've arrived. And arriving isn't a perfect arrival; it's an adequate arrival. It's when there will be a time you'll get used to yourself, and you'll get used to that point at which you start knowing that you're floundering. You're just starting to do realism to the picture, or dotting T's and crossing I's, and just all of a sudden your picture is starting to lose more than it gains. In other words, it's stopped moving in the direction of the great vision, and it's now starting to moving into some what is that law category? The perfection of it's all the T's crossed and I's dotted. So that really might be the greatest piece of this that you really want to get your brain around. But I'm going to look at a couple of pictures with you and see what comes to me, what else comes to me in terms of thinking about painters and finishing, okay? Because we know that finish is all over the place. The degrees of what you might call finish, and I do mean that different degrees of that today we would measure by the realism or the photographic at one end and the poetic impulse or the music at the other end. And I think it'll be very clear to you, but if you don't know what you're up to, what is that essential thing? If the essential thing is to make a thing look like, then you're going to be noodling a long time probably. But even at that, you're going to have to make a decision about getting out of there. And that's when you get to that bear and grow model where the idea is to maintain the unity all the way through this process, even if you are noodling to a higher and higher degree. You have to still maintain the unity of the general impression, even if you're just making a portrait likeness, you follow? Never mind the idea of having a poetic concept that has its own intrinsic unity that's very felt and on some level, either song or poetry. So let me read her point again. At what point do you call a painting finished, even though it doesn't capture the beauty of what you see? Well, as much as you want to, as much as you'd want to. Now, that's skill level stuff, too. And as you get along, you're going to find yourself approximating what you want better and better, right? That thing you've envisioned. So be patient with yourself as a student, as a person figuring out painting. You have to know, there's a certain, being blunt with yourself. You can begin to tell this isn't going anywhere. This isn't going to go any further. And I think she's right, though, when she says, accepting the best you can do with your current skill level. I think that's really a big deal. That's very, very the right kind of sober-mindedness that you have to have as a young student and as a person in the early phase of sorting out this whole problem with the nature of this form. And yet, as Gamma would say in his studio, we make pictures, so you still want to make the picture and get to the end of it. And keep remembering that Degas says, and you're going to what did he say? Do it the next one, right? So you're always looking forward to the next one because you're going to bring more to it, more of all the things that you value in painting. By the way, there's those things you value in painting. There's a lot of things you can have pride in painting. And I suggest to you, by the way, as a student, you really need to set yourself up to have those things built in. In other words, skill levels. For example, if you value and consider it a benefit and an aesthetic value to have a unified surface, when it isn't irregularly bumped and when a certain light hits it, gets sort of wrecked, I'd call craft things like that. So there's this element of good drawing. You don't call a picture, you don't even think of your picture as being something you walk away from if you've got really serious problems with your drawing. Would you? Well, what I'm saying is, so you set up a set of standards. I might have wanted to call this picture standards for the finish. What are the standards you have that are in every finish? Doesn't mean stylistically. Your pictures don't all have to be the same, but there are things that you'll do in every painting, right? And those are sorts of things you want to have figured out, right? You want to be as you make pictures, noticing that things aren't living up to things you value. Now, every picture isn't the same, but there are things like the sense of form. If you don't have a sense of form and you value a sense of form, get better at it, right? And there's all these things. I try to make this list of all the horses, right? And form is one of them. Light is one of them. Shape and the correlation of shapes, color play, color schemes. There's so many things that you want to be good at in that first phase, just as a skill as a skill base, but you will also intrinsically be inclined toward one. I mean, like some people might be more inclined toward a texture, a sense of texture, others to smoothness. Well, there'll be things that'll be part of your sort of basic makeup. I still say you really need to be good at whatever's required, like Paxton's model. He says when you hang a sign on your studio, it says painter, it means you can do whatever's required. So if somebody says, there's this textural thing, it's going to go into a wall that's very textured, and I did a mural that's going to have unity with that. Are you going to make him a smooth one? Or can you do that other thing? I know this is just theoretical. How much time would you allow yourself to work on a picture before saying that you just need to accept that it's the best you can do with your current skill level and move on to the next? And what I will say, how much time would you allow yourself? I know what you're talking about in that one sense that you you don't do these things well enough, and you could torture it until it's better. Um, I found that I like it when I get to the certain phase of a painting and I know I can't do it better to leave it like that, so that the next painting, when I see it sometime later, I'll actually feel pain and want to improve that skill, that bit of skill. If it's a skill problem, it's just something I just don't have a handle on, right? I like to have those things. I leave them to myself. I think that's a note to self, sort of a self-improvement note. And again, in the Degas mindset of we'll do it in the next one, right? So that's a big deal. And moving on to the next is it's not a defeat. It's platform, right? You learn from that past one. And so in some sense, you might say that as a student, especially, having these defeats is actually very directing. It's very, 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 very. It gets you into the self-correcting model really nicely. Let's just look at some pictures. That part, though, the idea of the personal side of this thing. I think I've said most of the thoughts that have gone through my mind when I hear those things. But I want to talk about finish in a different way, and that is the one thing that Baron Gros says is the finish. And this is where we've talked about it before. I'm just going to bring it up again. But that is the Baron Gros model, that a picture needs to be in unity from the beginning to the end. And Degas says a similar thing. He says, my painting is done when it's in harmony. Well, you want the Baron Gros model so that if you, as he's, I think I don't know if he said it in this literally in these words, but I've always managed to muck it up or make a almost a joke out of the way he handles it. But he says you want to be such that if you didn't survive the painting, you didn't actually finish it, that your family could come in and actually sell it because it would be in harmony. And Degas, you said it nicely, that fits into Degas' idea that he considers a painting finished not when it's all noodled up and looking like nature in the literal, real sense, but it's when it's in harmony. Well, all the elements, the colors are in harmony, right? The shape play, the spotting, the distribution of the lights or darks, and the colors and all those things, and their sizes to each other and all that stuff. The harmonious quality. So that's a victory, even if it's not precisely the harmony you were looking for. Okay, and those are high victories. Those are, how should I say, they're minimal victories. You want to have minimally that much victory, right? And I think you can actually have that one all the time. But you can see these are all in harmony, right? But they're not. None of them are finished. And that there's aspects of these things where you'd go, well, you'd say, even you looking at this might say, well, what's going on over there? But when you're in a start phase, you're trying to get my way of doing this. It's just like what I said about poetry. In that start phase, you need to have clarity. So when you get done with the start, you need to have the whole painting flowing out of those first and in harmony with those first two lines. And so I'm just saying you're trying to set up the unity of the color scheme that makes for that beauty. If you when you've set up a beautiful picture and you don't grasp the beauty, and you just start copying this and copying that and copying over, it ain't going to work out okay. Okay? You'll have to continually be watching for it to show up on the painting next to you. Okay? And that's the unity model, right? And I think I could assure you that you will not feel sad about your starts, about your the defects in your paintings. I mean, look at the guy. A lot of people would like to pick on a bunch of his stuff. A great draftsman that half the time looks like he can't draw, et cetera, et cetera. You know what I mean? So, but consider yourself needing mercy, right? But you mostly need mercy from yourself. But you have to know where you're headed. I just got to keep saying that. The start needs to show you where you're headed, and then now and I'll show you at the end of this thing one of my starts, and when I finished one, I wouldn't have told you necessarily that I knew where I was headed in that finished one. By the way, it was a very young student picture. The other one's a demonstration, but that crucial thing of having some idea, where there's no vision, the people perish. Have you heard that one? Old Testament. So here's a more developed, right? So he's got these going. And here you can see, and by the way, these are clearly in harmony. They're all there. All that's going to be there is there, right? And you might, as I said, what I was going to say to you though, once you're working from this harmony model, this unity model, the unity of the general impression, but the unity of the harmony that you see in the general impression, you'll quickly see things that aren't adequate, right? And those are called back stragglers, as you know. And the idea is to name them, say what that is. Is that a color or size problem? What is that? And be able to go to the panel that you're working on and change that part and see if it's not in greater harmony now. I'm trying to get you all to do that in a continuing, that's your whole modus operandi. If you're an impressionist, if you're painting from, if the scene before you is where the life is, where the magic is, when you're trying to project that magic, you have to have a vision of it, but you have to maintain the vision. You have to keep watching as it's beginning to show up, right? Your first 2 marks, it's not going to show up much, but even there, there'll be symptoms, there'll be hints, there'll be indications of it's coming. Okay, what was that line from Wordsworth? Intimations. I like that word. Yeah. So here you can see that these aren't precisely finished. They aren't highly noodled pictures, but you can see they're really closed in, right? This one, by the way, is got very hysterical in some ways. It looks like Tarbell took some brown house paint and just smeared over all the whatever was in the background before and wiped out. So it's a very curious picture in person. It still has this crazy, wonderful magic, though. Isn't that weird? One of the reasons I wanted to show it, though, is that it has this crazy, wonderful harmony within whatever it is anyway. This one is more evidently worked up and not worked up in a highly noodled way in the background area, but in the relational way. It's virtually every part is worked on some level, as opposed to just wiping out the background. But both of these are in that class of a next level evolution, right? The development of the painting, and they're moving. Yes, there is some movement toward more realistic, you might say, but it's not. The whole thing isn't becoming a realist painting, right? So you can see these things. They're levels, right? So this is pretty adequate for a first statement. This is pretty adequate for a first statement, but the second day out there can be way better than that. And this is way past the second day, but and with Tarbell, if he's having 24 sittings on a portrait, he's probably having as many sittings at least on these guys. But here's Tarbell, the more developed ones. And then I wanted to show you Tarbell's outdoor starts, and you can see that he's already got in hand the beauty of the light, the color scheme, and so much of the key drawing that sets up the composition. We are always after that, again, the grand unity of the general impression and getting enough data out there to then build to the finish. And the finish, again, doesn't mean to the noodled realism. It just means to wherever you want to take this thing. And that's, again, where you're doing your poetry. You're just listening and listening. At some point, it sort of contains the summary, the gist, the enough of the, so we say, the spirit or the essentials of the underlying concept, that you could say yes. But there again, we're back to that need. If you don't have that initial concept, how do you know when you're finished? But these aren't finishes. Neither one of these is. This one is way of a start, probably the first day or much more than that. And this one is probably multiple days, and he's probably waiting for his sitter to be able to sit for him again. But he went out there and stayed on the trees and did some other stuff, right? So I haven't seen this in person, so I can't tell you. I haven't looked at the paint to see it, but it looks like it's significantly more than in the background here, significantly more than that first day. So there is a tendency. Sometimes in a painting when you don't have people coming and going, sitters, there is a chance that the thing will fall apart developmentally. You just allow that, but you have enough of this if you did a good start for it to not fall out of sync with what you've got here. Good colors and good values here, and location and other things. General gesture of this area. There's enough here that when you go on to do levels of other things, like the ground that's always out there, waiting for his wife probably to come back, or one of his daughters to come back. It might be one of his daughters, I guess, and sit for him again, or the sunny day to show up again, right? It's sort of a midsummer, late summer picture. So in this picture here, though, you could easily see that you could say that's very adequate for the general impression of something like this. But this area down here and this probably would want to be developed more to bring them into harmony. But that's purely developmental harmony. Do you see what I mean? And that's a thing. As again, you have standards. I do prefer to have the painting covered the same way on the whole painting through the whole thing, so that you don't have wild chunks of canvas sticking out in odd places and that sort of thing. And those are things you have to think through for yourself about those kinds of standards. Standards that relate to when you're going to be happy that your picture is now okay. Most of it will be in this class, though, here of whether or not you have all the data relating to each other and it projects that thing that made you want to even paint it in the first place on a really adequate level. And again, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Be able to walk away because it's in that class of bringing something. And I say bringing, you do have an audience, and you're bringing it to your audience. So that's something to think about, isn't it, too? That's what does it have? Does it contain that essence that made me say yes, and that I'm hoping I can show somebody, just hold it up and say, "Do you see?" And isn't it marvelous? Nature or whatever, the beauty of color, of a beautiful woman under a darkening tree, in a golden field. But not by name, right? Not a girl, a field, no, but by the color scheme and the magic of whatever it is, though, that intrigues you. And it's the color and light, all that sort of stuff in the interplay of everything from color schemes to color distribution, et cetera, et cetera. And here's the more finished version, the Tarbell, and the most I guess I could have done there. But this one's really pushed, and you'd call it a painting where he said, "And I'm done." you know. But he doesn't have a realist model, does he? So as Gamma would say, the subject is light, even when he has girls in their chairs, having a chat with each other. The subject is light. That's a pretty interesting, not just interesting, but an important thing to be aware of. What is the essential beauty that you? If you set people out there and every time you put people out there, you have this noodling model. There are lots of paintings like that. I was going to say Julius Stewart. I'm not sure I'm right about that, but there's some Americans where no matter where they go, and I'm thinking of Ridgway Knight, Daniel Ridgway Knight, and what's the guy's name? Anyway, but there are a number of guys who are sort of realist impressionists, but they always have to do that. Their model of what's good is a noodled up academic face, and losing the face into the background at places, or the hair, whatever, isn't a thing. You got to get that line around it because it's the something else. So can you? One of the things I really maintain that when you work our way, your drawing's got to be adequate all the time. In other words, when you have a reading spot like this, it's got to be articulated from the time you put it down. It's got to do its job, but it doesn't mean it becomes a face and you're going to apply academic style to it. But when you do something like this, or this line over here, or any of these things, or any other place you find yourself drawing, articulate well those things. You won't need to go into this high level of exotic realism. If you can grasp what I'm saying to you here, there's an element of drawing that's very precise, but it's not extended. It's not extended to every little thing. There's a prioritization, and it has everything to do with, and you set it up for this reason too, but it has everything to do with what leads, what's important, visually important, what you must draw. You can see the face over here has nowhere near, by the shape of the face, has nowhere near the importance of the shape of this thing up here. or the shape of this face over here, et cetera, et cetera. And this face is virtually lost. It's virtually not there. While other things happen to read really nicely that are what is that? Why is this thing here reading better than the face? Well, all these things are about in the setup. And if you have a certain kind of a mindset, you will be setting up faces so they stick out and do whatever in a certain way. Or if you see women in these chairs and you admire things like the curious way in which we in our environment drift in and out of it. And sometimes we're more present in relation to nature. Sometimes we are lost in the woods. There's an aspect of that that is very compelling and truth delivering of a sort. Yes, but you can see that there's a significant amount of drawing, articulation, or additional stuff. He's really gone to levels of you might say, the minor stuff. Maybe it happened because he wanted to get all this stuff in here, and then all this looked really weird when it was vague and blank. Weird in relation to what he was trying to get in relation to nature. Women in nature, they just didn't feel like they were in anywhere. It looked like a green. This is not an unusual thing to do too, but it looked like a green wall behind them instead of flowers. Maybe he's maybe he's poetically aligning the women as flowers or as blossoms or whatever in a field. Do you see what I mean? What's the vision? What's the vision? Keep hanging on to that idea. What's the vision? Here's Degas. These paintings, I never actually liked these early ones much, although I always admired his drawing in them. The compositions, they're not something, they're not bad or anything. But they're, what we're talking about now is what's his model, right? And how are you going to approach the whole thing? When you get to this, now this is called less finished, but it's equally finished. This is where Degas is talking about, later in his life, he's telling you that it's about the harmony, not the finish. And I suggest that possibly earlier on he had a different model. Look at the working up of the head in this thing, or the data, the little data, the flower watering, or whatever that pot is for, et cetera, the faces. This is on the level of what you might call realism. Is that your model? Now, you go into a room and there are places where that actually is required because the music is of that sort. And I would never pick on anybody for not being an impressionist, provided they understand the idea of the reason for, the aesthetic reason for the clear noodling of dark pattern, shall we say, or whatever else it is, or any other clarity of form or anything else. You want to have an aesthetic reason for it, and that's all. But this one, you can see that he's ended without having, he's very gestural, if you want to call it that way. The gestures are very compelling. It's like they're women waiting off stage or something like that, and they're a little tired, and they're going to have to run back out there again. But they're right now either stretching or staying stretched or something or other. But in the meantime, look at this music dance. Look at the colored dance in this picture. When was this one finished? But this one is clearly finished, isn't it? In some ways, I see fewer problems with this one than I do with this one. Do you know what I mean? So if I say fewer problems architecturally, or what you might say, or in terms of composition, this picture actually is in this remarkable coloristic harmony. Just to start with, it's just a delight. And you might say linearly as well. The shapes, the shapish play. As it wanders through here, all these things happening. It's a fascinating pictorial piece of pictorial music. But you can see that it's in harmony. It's in harmony. I can't imagine. You could say, well, what's that doing there? But one of the things about a painting by Degas, it pays great dividends if you watch longer. What is anything doing in Degas' picture? He's the guy who says, if it's in there, there's a reason for it. There's a reason in the picture for it, and he doesn't mean a storytelling reason. That's not the Degas at any point. At that point, his conversation does not suggest that at all. So there you are with that. And then here's doing a more finished one. This is one of the most exotic bits of drawing, painted, finessed drawing I think I've seen in American art. It stuns me. It's a beautiful thing. then he's right down here, and he's actually going blotchy and trying to maintain something of a more crusty color thing with whatever she's wearing, looking very medieval, by the way. And I don't know what he was, but there's a, so, but you can see that he hasn't done a bunch of careful noodling, and you'll see that in Thayer as well. He hasn't done a bunch of careful noodling in every little place. He didn't try to take everything to this level. Now, there are levels of finish that can be different in a picture, obviously, and still the thing can still have harmony. But there are also two different kinds of pictures. There are more finished pictures, so there's more. Some that are more in the realistic vein, and there are others. Well, you have to know what it is, the music that you're looking at in your setup there. Look at it longer. Even once you've set it up, your job is to begin to understand it, so you can actually get your head around, and have a vision of what it needs to do to succeed, aesthetically succeed, right? To be beautiful. So, but you can see he's got a certain element of this. I think these are fairly big pictures. I'm not sure how big. I didn't. These are not like the same. I think this is far bigger than that one, but I wanted to show you some of that drawing close up. But this is obviously a whole different thing. It's much more like the Degas. There's an element of what you'd call the linear dance, and this is elegant in every way. The spotting is nice. The grand size of the little three lights, or even four, whatever. But there's a thing here it's got a different motive, and you could say it's a more decorative motive, right? And he has to get to the point where all the elements decorative have to be in sync with each other, right? I doubt that he had all these girls. In fact, I suspect this was one model here, and he's designing this field with the idea of creating a line dance of sorts, right? And with a musician, with a harpist over in the side. So at some point, he's got his game, though, is to create, including her, and create a line, right? To create a line that is the equivalent of a line of music or a line of dance in a visual way. And you can see that he does it. He's successful. He's nothing. There's no problem in this one. And at that point, what is he done? He's already got some level of finish that he's decided on. So it's not like he's trying to execute. And when he goes back into here and makes trees, he's not going into realism, even though he did some of it more or less in areas on the, and you'll see that again in Thayer as well, and some of the others. But how do you know when you're finished? When that line, when you produce the magic of that line, isn't that easier? That's significantly easier than just have the taskmaster of noodling to the finish. So that, to the crossing all the T's and dotting the I's of the realistic handling. So I'm not offended by I love realistic handling, but I love more the correlation of it with itself and other, with elements like itself. It's got its own rationale, whereas the realism is a realism talking to the realism in a picture, and how does, what game in particular are we up to? Where does the aesthetic lie? So once you start talking about form, maybe the form of a breast or something like that, there are correlations, various kinds of correlations throughout a whole picture, and you're expecting that you've already seen it and you've found these, and at some point there's enough harmony of the interplay of these things, right, that you're just able to say yes to them, right? So here's and it's more or less finished. And I used to actually, not this one, and I don't know that I've ever seen this. I'm hoping and praying that this actually isn't in this, but I think it is. It looks like one, but it'd be a quite early one. But that was we seemed to live in a more or less academic model. And then he wound up, for different reasons apparently, going in a direction that doing is more like doing. And so, it's the mystery of light is definitely happening here, but the execution is way different. He's not trying to noodle up every leaf on every bush and all that sort of thing. And one of the things that happens to you when you start getting into this and you start finding the aesthetic in your picture, you're finding the beauty of the composition, and then you say, now I'm going to finish it, and you mean you're going to noodle it up, and you just walk over there and just become this noodle guy, you will destroy the beauty. That's the hard part of painting, is to maintain the idea that you're in composition all the time. You never get out of the composition. So if the composition is the making up of trees and all that sort of stuff, that's your primary thing, is to make the realistic trees and have them in a good place. It's its own thing, but there are other beauties. In fact, I think realism is a tough game, is a tough nut. I think realism has this terrible need to be all about itself and not about the poetry of the fields. How good does that cow look real? Is that what kind of a thing is that? But that's what you set your viewer up for. Do they look like they're really in water? Does it really look like dirt and grass? And do you really? I mean, that's a question. I mean, you can do that if you want to be that guy. But I just say I've never found joy in that, and I don't find there's kind of an endless there's a kind of an endless tedium to the realistic model. And but there's liberty, there's freedom in the aesthetic model, and I'm saying just figuring out what is the beauty of this abstraction, that we're looking at here. What is the beauty of that, And when you're standing there looking at it, I think he ultimately concluded. I know we hear things about him trying to find a spiritual content, but I'm suspecting he meant an emotional content. But maybe he did mean something spiritual, but he might have conflated it, or one of the things that's obviously there in painting all the time is this the feeling for the subject, right? It's a big deal, In poetry, it's even more so, Just getting the rhyme scheme right is not going to get you anywhere, and neither is just getting the words to say pictures, and there's this emotive content that you have to get to, and there are better ways to phrase. And I like that C.S. Lewis said, "I learned to write when I learned to suggest." So we're living in an interesting place when we talk about all these things like finish. But let me just end with this and talk about finishes. I didn't mean to go this long. But you see here a lay-in, a start. This is trying to show students how I would lay in a painting, cover the canvas, and then be able to walk away and say, now tomorrow I'm going to come back and I'm going to bring this now. So I want this to be the color scheme to be true. I want the great architecture of this thing, the major events, visually strong events. I want them to be right and right in relation to each other. I want them to be strongly expressed, so their content is there, and the field is all in unity already, in harmony with itself. But what I call this, I wouldn't have the temerity to call this a loose finish. So this is a finish on the left, and this is a start on the right. Now this is a finish. This is more closely aligned with an academic finish, no question, right? I was much closer to Gamble and that stuff in those days. And I don't know that I even laid pictures like this in. I was in the movement toward this, but I don't think I even laid pictures in as aggressively lost and found as I'm doing in this one. But if you're looking at this one, you can see, even as it is now, that there is a need, because based on how much information is here, just in terms of unity and representation, I can see more going on. I can understand more about the real here and the real here than I can here. So these become back straggler areas, right? And they're design areas where the hair is constantly moving. You need to get your determining factors in there, the things that aren't going to shift on you, and then find a way to incorporate and design the hair into a harmony with those things. Putting it that way, because the model comes and goes. I mean, the model's her hair changed every time she sat down, and it changed dramatically sometimes. We had this thing where we know we wanted the hair on her shoulder and over her shoulder over here, and how much on each one, more on one side than the other. That was my choice. But you can see that what the first thing in terms of getting this into a more complete unity would be to get these guys, less doubtful. They look like paint, where other parts start looking like, what they are. So there's an element of treatment that incorporates more of the look of nature. And you want some level. I like to, as the Baron Grow model goes, I like to maintain that level of harmony, of treatment, right? So whatever I'm working toward, like there's a sense of form here as much as there is in other places. There's a sense of form I'm trying to get throughout the painting. There's a sense of light that's correlated. The edge relationships are good, But when I'm doing something like this, I don't walk away from this with a V, a notch. I make that look like what I saw. So there's darker on this side, lighter on this side, the sharpness of the edges, all that stuff, enough to convey the look of the blouse on the body. And so there's this element of the realistic, shall we say, a thing like this. That's the look of nature there on that spot. And there's only two or three of them that I really nailed, really pushed. Or a handful that I really pushed. Like you take the eye, there's a piece of this that's pushed, but that has to be developed as much as it needs to be to get the full, to get the ensemble of these players, including other ones, into into a harmony with each other. So, but you can see that this would, just in terms of being what you could call a finished art or a unified expression, you get to a certain point and you would say, now that actually could stand as a freestanding painting. But what is that? It's the aesthetic correlation, or at least the correlation of the parts that relate to each other and create the aesthetic, create the beauty. But again, main thing, if you have a clear idea of what you have in front of you, pictures can end all sorts of places. They can end with a with a with this kind of a finish, which could be pushed further, by the way. I mean, it could be. This is me being as broad as I can be. I'm not really trying to get into. I'm not getting my microscope out. I don't. Do you see any reason to? Well, there might be in a given situation. There might be a reason to articulate certain things better. There might be an aesthetic reason to articulate certain passages of the hair up here with more finesse so that they correlate better with some of this articulate stuff down here. That's the kind of stuff you'd be looking for. Does it have to have it? Is a different question, right? And that's the kind of thing where well enough alone is one of those things. You can leave well enough alone. And the perfection, which I found over and over again, the perfectionist model, it will really be the enemy of beauty. What is the perfectionist model? You can't even live up to it, but you don't even know actually what it is. what am I living up to? But the model is sitting before you, and you keep looking and looking and looking for whether what have we got here? What have we got? Try to grasp it in your mind. Try to get clarity about it. And that's why the looking 4 times is such a big deal. But just look and look and look and look until something dawns on you, and it touches you. It got to touch you somewhere. I say in the thymus. It's got to touch you in a funny place where it registers, right? That's called emotional registration. You've got to get to the point of having emotional registration so that when you're working, you're looking to have the same registration on your painting. And I can assure you, when you do, there'll be some element of that available to your viewer, right? You could say that's when you're done. I don't have any more to add to that, and I'd love to have more discussion about this. I may bring Selma back. She offered to be in a Zoom with me, so we might do one more on finish. You'll have to take a look at this, Selma, see how it goes, see what you think. If I'm getting closer to giving you some satisfaction about that personal side of finish, right? And it is all personal. Gamel's thing about composition being very personal is because we don't have the same hearts, we don't have the same reference points, we don't have the same cultural backgrounds. Some people grew up. I had a student, a good friend still, who grew up in India, and her colors, she had an exotic color field that I thought, golly, is that garish? But she had a sense of the beauty of that. I said, Paul, you really do have to figure that out. Is there such a thing as high contrast? I'm sorry, highly chromatic colors just everywhere? Is there a field like that can actually work? And eventually you do find guys like maybe Brangwyn or somebody like that, and you'll see in their work that they're living in this kind of place where you'd have thought, well, that's way too much. Even some of the colors don't seem to go together until you find that there is a logic. There finally is a logic. But you have the cultural, the background, you know what I mean? Some of that is, who knows how that works? Do you see what I'm saying? But nevertheless, it's personal. My point is, it's personal. So that's when Gamel says composition is very personal. He doesn't mean that there's not a right and wrong to it, or a better, that you couldn't improve that composition. And there are laws related to it, right? There is order. So, but you're not going to ever paint a beautiful picture by the law. Do you know what I mean? The letter of the law, right? Killeth. That's what the scriptures say. All right. So there's this other thing, right? It's the spirit. That's the spirit. And you got to own that in the beginning. You stay looking longer before you even pick up your anything to mark with. Okay? Isn't that a funny way to finish? All right. Okay. And so let me thank our wonderful friends here. And that is Nancy D, for your repeated offerings. So thankful. Jacqueline M and John J for your recurring ones, and for everybody all your sharing, liking, commenting. Really appreciate that stuff. Keep subscribing. Far and wide, the more people that see it, the more we likely will be able to sustain ourselves here. I'm talking again. I'm telling you, I don't make anything off this at all, nothing. And so it comes to, but Mr. Producer does need every penny so far that we're making. It really is just giving him the right, what's the right word? What he's due, his a rate that's just a standard rate in his field. So, all right, you all. And I know he's willing to sacrifice at times. So don't don't think we're not thankful though for everything you guys bring. And I'm not thankful, even though it's just to keep this coming to you and all the rest of, to have this conversation, emboldening this conversation, enabling this conversation. So to the degree of value, it, thank you very much. I sound like a preacher trying to raise money. I'm so sorry. I was raised around that. That was a thing in my house. So, all right. You all have a great painting week, and we'll see you in the next one. Okay. I won't see you. Okay.